This is David Badin. I'm with the Israel Resource News Agency at the Badin Center for Near East Policy Research. And we're going to begin a discussion, a very important discussion, UNRWA, U.S. Anti-Incitement Accord, what happened to it. By coincidence, today, the Al-Quds online magazine of the PLO featured a very important piece, which is relevant to this discussion, praising the fact that the United States handed over $135 million to UNRWA on July 17th. This is the first official confirmation we've had of that. We knew it was in the air, but now it's there. It was 2 days, actually 3 days after the anti-incitement agreement. 2 weeks after the anti-incitement agreement, we asked the UNRWA spokesman, will you be making any adjustments in the school books? The answer was no. Well, we don't own the school books. That was a very clear answer. No intervention, even though there have been times in the last few years that the PA school books, certain PA school books were eliminated after we revealed what was in them. So the program right now, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Dr. Richard Goldberg, who is perhaps the most knowledgeable person in Washington. When he was in the U.S. Congress, he worked with Senator. He was a staff person for Senator Mark Kirk, and he knows his stuff. And I'll ask Mr. Goldberg here his attitude, his understanding of the U.S. UNRWA Accord, and what the possibility is that it would be honored, and to put it in the context of the work he's done over the years on the subject of the UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency. I was very, very optimistic. Some people who are hearing this program today heard my talk in June, which is also on a Skype. I received from the White House and from the State Department the clear criteria the United States was going to use, even better than what we got from Trump. Very clear criteria for oversight. And what happened to it? It seems to have has gone the way of all flesh. So I'd like to hear Richard Goldberg's assessment of this. And then we're going to, what I was asked to do was to prove through evidence of that we had audiovisual evidence we have that violence is actually being taught in the schools. So we've taken 12 or 13 clips, put them together. You'll see. We'll then have some comments from Dr. Arnon Gross, who has done research on this subject, and I see the Baroness Ruth Deitch, who sits in the House of Lords. We'll ask her to make a comment. And if you ask me what the goal is, well, it's exactly what we said to the Presidium of the United Nations Secretary General's office, which is to activate the donor nations, because that was basically the idea we got from the UN Secretary General. If you want to do something serious, get the donor nations involved. So without further ado, Rich Goldberg, please, let's hear your perspective of the UNRWA U.S. anti-incitement agreement, which was signed on July 14th with a lot of fanfare. Thank you.
Well, thanks, David. Appreciate everyone having me. Just give me a thumbs up if the audio is sounding good. Excellent. We'll go from there. You never know with the Zoom realities. And a pleasure to be with you all today. Look forward to your questions. I'll step back just a little bit and go through my history, which spans the last 17 years with UNRWA in various oversight capacities in the U.S. government. In some ways, I feel like we're always back to the future with these conversations. This is not the first time we've talked about incitement. It's not the first time we've talked about many of the systemic issues we often discuss with UNRWA relations with entities that may have terrorist affiliations, the use of UNRWA facilities and attacks, et cetera. But the incitement issue is one that really goes back several decades. The Congress has raised this several times with UNRWA staff over various Secretary Generals. We originally asked the GAO to look at this in the 2000s. There were pushes to have the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, take a look at it again in the 2010s. Nothing ever seemed to change. The story from UNRWA historically was always We don't make these textbooks. These are not our textbooks. These are host government textbooks. I'm sure you've all heard the same refrain. Wherever they operate, they take textbooks from the quote unquote host governments into the schools, they say. And so these were Palestinian textbooks that they had inherited. And yet they were using them and they continue to use them. And every time where we would find evidence from David or others of textbooks that continue to have this incitement towards Israelis, incitement towards the concept of peace, incitement towards Jews, anti-Semitic references, even in math problems. The answer was, we will look into it, we will change. Nothing ever did. In general, what we have a problem here is an oversight and governance problem. My issue from a U.S. taxpayer oversight perspective has long been our lack of ability to influence change at the organization. We have other international organizations upon which we as donor nations sit on a board of directors or a board of advisors or a board of governors. We sit to make election to whoever will lead the organization for a number of years. You think about many of those multinational organizations, the UN-related organizations, the specialized agencies, the IAEA, very important mission. We sit on a board of governors. We hold quarterly meetings of those board of governors. We have oversight of the finances. We elect the director general. Many organizations like that as well. We'll be having an election for WHO Secretary General coming up. We were having one for UPU, the Universal Postal Union, actually right now. These are not new ideas, yet we have this sort of ancient governance structure of a GA oversight, a GA appointed Sec Gen, and a culture of sort of just give us the money, we'll deal with your questions and conditions later. There was the sort of hope that perhaps over the last couple of years, the decision by the Trump administration to pull its funding, obviously, was a dramatic one. Caught, I think, a lot of people by surprise. But two things I think happened. Number one, within the donor community that stayed, there was this beginning of a feeling of donor fatigue. Where has this money been going? Why is this our responsibility alone? Where is the direction of the agency heading? We have all these systemic problems of incitement, of terror finance, et cetera. But we have an even larger systemic issue, which is, what is the mission and mandate of the agency long term? How is this sustainable from a entitlement perspective? That you would have a population that can continue to grow over time in the millions and expect that the status quo can be continued forever, where people remain called refugees, even if they live within territories controlled by the Palestinian Authority, or if they live as citizens of another country like Jordan, that we will continue to consider them refugees, define them as such, and add to the rolls so that today we say 5 to 6 million. In 10 years, that number will grow even more. Is that sustainable for the international community? Is that good from a human rights perspective, an economic rights perspective for the Palestinians themselves? And then, of course, these core issues of, if we are truly sincere about preparing populations for peace, of promoting a two-state solution long term, how does UNRWA fit into that? If the structure of the organization and the culture of the organization keeps generations believing that they are waiting on a right of return, that they are not preparing for a two-state solution within certain borders that we've all long expected, that they're waiting to go into where Israel proper is today, over the Green Line, returning to their quote-unquote ancestral homes, that they would be taught to hate Israel, that they would be taught to hate Jews, and that they would have people on staff, beneficiaries who are tied to organizations, obviously with dedicated missions to destroy the state of Israel. So these are a lot of questions fundamentally that we have of the direction of the agency. We had heard that under this administration coming in, under the Biden administration, resuming funding, resuming the commitment to U.S. assistance to UNRWA, stepping back to where the U.S. had been prior to the Trump administration's cuts and then withdrawal of all funding back in that 2018 timeframe. We are looking at likely accelerating back to that $250 million annually or more between the assessed contributions and the voluntary emergency appeals. And so the question is, what were we going to get for that money? There was some sort of MOU signed between the White House and UNRWA. Details of that have leaked out. People on Capitol Hill have been asking for detailed copies of those to be able to examine them, but have not received them. But what we do know is that for the administration's own testimony before Congress, UNRWA had made promises that it had made in the past. When the Obama administration attempted a similar approach with UNRWA, when the Bush administration had attempted similar approaches with UNRWA, where they were vowing to eliminate incitement within their schools, within their textbooks, from the education system. They would vow to ensure their funding and money is not going to any sort of terrorist activity. And on every count of their promises, of course, we continue to find new evidence, as David's already, obviously published and spoken about, as have others. So, we can continue to try to treat this symptom instead of treating the disease. And usually in foreign policy and in policy in general, treating symptoms just means that you will have a chronic problem and you'll never actually fix the underlying issues. And I think from a governance structure, from a mandate perspective, from a direction, what is the next 5 years for UNRWA? What is the next 10 years for UNRWA? And we as a donor community need to have those conversations because no one else seems to be having them. I'll pause there and happy to take some questions.
The question I would like to raise is what would be the best way to inform all the donor nations of what's going on. Most recently, we found that both in New Zealand and in Canada, UNRWA had given strong reassurances that the school books would be changed, would be adapted, happy days are here again. And the question is how we can form a situation where the donor nations know what's going on. I may want to suggest, and I would like to hear later on Baroness Leach's perspective, perhaps the initiation of what we might call an interparliamentary UNRWA policy task force to look at these things. I mean, back in 1991, I've been working on this since 1987. In 1991, at the time of the Madrid conference, there was something called there was a body that was established but never convened. So I'd like to know what is your comment on there? How do you think that kind of structure would work?
Well, it's an interesting idea. I think in general, I would start from the principle of we have to view ourselves not just as donors to a cause where we sign a check and wait for the annual report and get it in the mail and say, sounds good, thanks, let us know how much we owe next year. That is not how you would govern your own donations or investments in life. It is not how you would treat a regular private foundation that you might be a major contributor to. You would ask for continued assessment and oversight. You might sit on the board of that organization. You might have some sort of an intergovernmental task force or oversight body that sets up various checks to verify certain things that the management is telling you. We don't have any of that with UNRWA today. And so it does make sense to, with pooled resources, which means pooled leverage, think of ways to condition that assistance and have processes to verify that the conditions we have set for our investment are being met. In the education system, that would not be hard to do. It is possible to monitor schools. It is possible to monitor curriculum. It's also possible to set the curriculum and to demand different aspects of curriculum be added and to review what they're going to teach, how they're going to teach it before it is taught, and to have various ways to verify that it has been taught and implemented correctly. When we are dealing with raising the generation of millions of children, every generation, to grow up either to have conflict or to have peace, to have hatred or to have tolerance. And in every generation, UNRWA has failed in this task. And it is a major contributor to the fact that we still have protracted conflict. And so this needs to be taken into consideration into the larger strategy that we have to promote peace and tolerance in the region. Otherwise, this will continue to be another generation raised to hate rather than to make peace.
I would like to comment that the issue of hatred is something we see less and less of. That's in a sense good news. On the other hand, we see education to war, education to violence. As a social work professional, I do not see the call to hatred. I see the call to violence. What I'd like to show right now is I've been asked to show evidence, not only from the school books, but how they're being taught. So I'd like to show a very short film right now, which is basically takes from a number of the films we've made over the years with the assistance of Arab television crews on the scene. And then after that, we can discuss that. And also Dr. Gross can show what he has found in the textbooks, and we'll go back to Rich Goldberg. Thank you.
السلام عليكم. بدي أسألكم من وين أنتوا أصلكم؟ من أي بلد؟ وبعدين بنحكي عن النكبة شوي. تفضل. من أي بلد؟
من فلسطين.
من حيفا، يافا.
احنا من حيفا.
من حيفا.
من يافا. من قضا يافا بيت دجن.
بيت دجن.
يافا قضا يافا.
قضا يافا.
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 من يافا.
يافا.
يافا. حيفا.
طيب هذه البلاد اللي تهجرنا منها ب 1948 تهجرنا من بيوتنا وكانوا أجدادنا في هذه البلاد معززين مكرمين، فأجى الاحتلال طردهم وشردهم من هذه البلاد وأجوا تحت خيام. إن شاء الله بنعود لهذه البلاد مرة تانية لبلادنا معززين مكرمين إن شاء الله. برضه إحنا بنحارب وبنساوي بعلمنا وبأنفسنا إن شاء الله يا رب، بالعلم وبالجهاد إن شاء الله بنرجع لبلادنا.
طيب صح لعبنا اليوم وكل شيء، اليوم بدنا نحكي لكم قصة. طيب اسمعوني يلا. هلا احنا زمان وانا صغيره ما كنتش مولوده ولا حد كان فينا مولود، لساتنا كلنا مش جايين على الدنيا. كانوا اهالينا على البحر وعلى بالسفن ويطلعوا وينزلوا وسيارات معهم ومعهم قصر وفلال. وين تبي بدون بحر؟ احنا في عنا بحر؟ وين البحر؟ صح نفسنا نروح على البحر؟ زمان كان عندنا بحر، كانوا سيدي وستي ضلوا على البحر، كل ليلة يجي يمسكونا ويحكوا لنا شو هالقصة. كانوا يحكوا لنا نضلنا على البحر ونسبح على البحر ونضل نطشنا على البحر. احنا فيش عندنا بحر صح؟ صح نفسنا نروح على بحر حيفا ويافا وناصر وعكا صح؟ وهلا واحنا على البحر سمعيني، واحنا على البحر قاعدين مبسوطين احنا والعيله وجايبين الناس على البحر. اجى الديب. ومين هذا الديب؟ اليهود صح؟ اليهود ديب. شو عملوا لنا؟ شو عملوا اليهود فينا؟ طرونا وشردونا وقتلونا وطخوا اهالينا، طرونا من بلدنا وقتلونا واخذوا ابونا واخذوا سيدنا وحبسوهم صح؟ وين طرونا؟ وين اخذونا؟ شردونا وين؟ عايزين على المخيم. كان هذا المخيم هيك المخيم؟ لا، شو كان؟ خيم صح. كنا عايشين بخيام، كنا بخيام لكان ماي. وين كنا عايشين؟ على البحر وبالسفينة ومبسوطين وبنلعب. ولا حد كان يجي يطخ بالليل ولا حد يتدخل فينا صح؟ هلا وين جابونا؟ على هالمخيم، على الخيام. مين أجبنا لنا المخيم؟ مين أبنى لنا هدول الدور بالمخيم؟ كنا عايشين بخيم إحنا. مين؟ لا، مين أجل بنى لنا المخيم لاجئين؟ الوكالة صح. انتوا هلا بتدرسوا مدارس الوكالة للاجئين صح؟ احنا ما كناش عايشين هون. اذا هذا المخيم مش مخيمنا صح؟ احنا وين كنا عايشين؟ عكا والناصرة والبحر. لمين كان البحر؟ لمين كانت الدور الحلوة الفلال والقصور؟ لمين؟ ومين شردنا؟ بدنا نرجع حيفا ويافا؟
احنا الخيار الوحيد اللي برجعنا لحق العودة، الدم بالدم والعين بالعين والبادي أظلم. هم اللي أجوا علينا، زي ما هم طلعونا احنا لازم نطلعهم.
هذا المخيم برا شو طلع من عنا؟ قدمنا شهداء وأسرى واستشهاديين ودور تدمرت. شو عملنا بالمخيم؟ من عنده شهيد؟ مين أبوه شهيد؟ أخوه شهيد؟ أبوه أسير؟
أنا شهيدة.
مين؟
بهاء.
ليش إحنا عملنا شهداء؟ عشان شو؟ مش عشان نحرر الأقصى ونرجع حيفا ويافا؟ فلسطين عربية من المي للمية. أعلى. فلسطين عربية من المي للمية. فلسطين عربية من المي للمية. بدنا حيفا، بدنا عكا. بدنا حيفا، بدنا عكا. رايحين على الأقصى، رايحين على الأقصى. فلسطين إلنا من المي للمية.
في فرق ما بين المنهاج الدراسي اللي مقرر للتدريس، وفي فرق ما بين مفاهيمنا كمعلمين لاجئين. المنهاج الدراسي مقيد، بتحدث عن بعض المفاهيم البسيطة جدا جدا. احنا بنحاول نغذي هذا الموضوع من حيث انه نقدر نخرج عن اطار المنهاج، وبالتالي نصل لمفهوم الحقيقي، لمفهوم حق العودة وتثبيته بأذهان الأطفال. أكيد في فرق بين مين هو المعلم اللي بيعلمهم، قناعته. يعني إذا هو بده يتعلم من يعني أشخاص بيميلوا لإطار ديني معين، فبالتالي بيعتبر إسرائيل هي دولة لازم تزول.
شو بتعطي الطلاب عن اللاجئين وحق العودة؟
في المناهج معنى المخيم هو مكان أقيم للاجئين الفلسطينيين الذين أجبروا على ترك قراهم ومدنهم بسبب الاحتلال. وبنعطيهم معنى لاجئ. شو معنى لاجئ؟ اللاجئ أصله من إيه؟ من وين بيجي؟ أصله من 48، الأراضي اللي احتلت سنة 1948. طب ليه جيتوا هون؟ بنسألهم، بقولوا إحنا جينا هون لأنه اليهود أجبرونا، أخذوا أراضينا وأخذوا بياراتنا وأخذوا دورنا وأجبرونا على الرحيل وعملوا مجازر.
في المنهاج فيه؟
في، بس في معنى المخيم وتاريخ النكبة.
طيب الأولاد بيحلموا إنهم يرجعوا الجيل؟
كلهم بيحلموا. تسأل الولد بيقول لك أنا أصلي من يافا، أنا أصلي من سلمة، أنا أصلي من يعني كل واحد حافظ مكان بلده.
طيب في منهم بيحكوا مثلا عن المقاومة، عن شيء؟
كلهم لما تصير الشغلات بيطلعوا كلهم، وبعدين يوم النكبة بيرفعوا الرايات السود وبيطلعوا مظاهرات وبيعلقوا بوسترات في الشوارع وفي المدارس بيحيوها في كلمات عن النكبة.
حسب رأيك يا أستاذ، اللي حصل في غزة بينمي روح الشهادة عند الأجيال عنا؟
طبعا أكيد تنمي روح الشهادة.
نعم.
ولأنهم أصحاب قضية، أصحاب حق هم. فيعني مهما كان راح يضل في ناس طالعين، في ناس تجاهد، في ناس تقاوم هذا العدوان الغاشم.
احنا سألنا اليوم بعض الطلاب كتير عبروا عن شعورهم انهم حابين يكونوا شهداء. شو رأيك يا أستاذ؟
يعني هم يعني بشكل عام،
نعم،
يعني لما يقول انه الشهاده واجرها كبير عند الله،
نعم،
فهم يعني حابين.
بيسألوك شو معنى الجهاد يا أستاذ؟
بيسألوني شو معنى.
شو بتقول لهم يا أستاذ؟
انه الجهاد له منزله عليا عند الله تعالى.
نعم. وانه هذا فرض.
هذا فرض على كل شخص وكل فرد موجود موجود على سطح الارض. بيسالوني بيقولوا لي يعني مثلا الصواريخ هاي يعني لازم نطلقها، لازم نرد على العدوان. طبعا لازم نرد على العدوان.
برنامج حماس ثابت في المنهاج التربوي والإعداد، وكذلك في برنامج المقاومة. من خلال هذا الميثاق نقدم رؤيتنا لهذا الصراع مع الاحتلال، نقدم مبادئنا ونقدم آليات التحرير من خلال المقاومة. طبيعة العلاقة بين حماس واليونروا هي علاقة طيبة وجيدة. نحن نحرص على تسهيل وتيسير أعمال اليونروا، ويحدث تواصل في بعض الأمور التي قد يحتاجون لتسهيل الأمور، ولكن الآن كما قلت أن الاتصال المباشر هو مع الحكومة. نحن نقول أن هذه التهدئة وهي تمثل بالنسبة للمقاوم استراحة مقاتل حتى يتم تحرير أرضنا ومقدساتنا. المقاومة من حقها أن تطور إمكاناتها.
To encourage jihad or holy war, UNRWA students regularly participate in school plays. Here, students dressed as terrorists emerge from a tunnel and simulate the kidnapping of an Israeli soldier.
They also praised Mohammed Asaf, the official youth ambassador for UNRWA.
أنا بعرف أغاني محمد عساف، إنها حلوة، إنها لبلدنا هي الأغاني.
شو بتعرف أغاني محمد عساف؟
عن دم فلسطين.
Among Arab youth, Asaf is wildly popular for his violent music videos that promote jihad and the destruction of Israel.
كل شيء كوفية، على الكوفية.
للكتف بحنية جفر عتابة ودحية، خلي البارود يهلل ويحليها، خلي البارود يهلل ويحليها.
ويجب أن نحقق العودة في يوم من الأيام، ونسعى إلى تحقيق العودة إلى قرانا وبلداننا. يعني حلمنا أن نعود، ووعد رباني أنه نعود، هذا من ناحية العقيدة.
نشجع الطلاب على المشاركة إن شاء الله رب العالمين في فعاليات العودة.
تحيا فلسطين العربية الحرة. المجد والخلود لشهدائنا الأبرار. الحرية للأسرى والمعتقلين. القدس لنا، القدس لنا، القدس لنا. يا ستي، أبويا شهيد، أخويا أسير، عمي جريح، لا عمل لنا، لا مستقبل لعلمنا، لا عودة لنا، شو صار لحالنا؟ والله حرام الأيام. وأنا مخبيالك مفاجأة. شو هذه المفاجأة يا ستي؟ خذي هذا المفتاح وحطي أمانة في ركبتك، لما أموت افتحي الدار واسقي شجرة الزيتون. هذا المفتاح بدي أحفظ فيه، وإن شاء الله سأطرد الصهيوني من دارنا وأسقي شجرة الزيتون، ونعود لوطننا الحبيب فلسطين، ونعود لوطننا الحبيب فلسطين.
في هذا العام مخيمات راجع لبلادي بمشاركة ما يزيد عن 100,000 مشارك ومشاركة.
المتآمرين، جماهير شعبنا الصامد المرابط، أبناءنا وإخواننا وأهلنا في مخيم شافاط، مخيم البطولة والفداء، مخيم الصمود في زمن قل فيه الرجال وقلت فيه النخوة. نحييكم بتحية الإسلام العظيم وتحية كتائب الشهيد عز الدين القسام. رسائلنا إليكم وباختصار شديد، فأنا عن فنون الكلام أسكت فمي وتركت للرشاش أن يتكلمي.
لكن نيجي بنقعدهم إنه أنت إيش بلدك، إيش بلدك، إيش بلدك. الأطفال بتعرفوا على كذا بلد، مش أنا بس القدس، لا، إذا أنا وطني فلسطين في كذا مدينة، يعني في بصير انتماء اكثر للطفل، يعني بصير الاطفال هنا يعني عندنا ما بيخلي، يعني حتى الان صار الولد عند الطفل او البنت عندنا صارت كثير متشوقه ترجع لبلدها الاصلي.
راجع بلادي راجع بلادي على ارض الاقصى، راجع بلادي انا ولادي انا ولادي على ارض الاقصى، راجع بلادي يا محلى القعده يا محلى القعده في حكورتنا، يا محلى القعده ما بنسى وعده ما بنسى وعده، نرجع ارضنا وما بنسى وعده.
Here they chant the song in the classroom.
وأزيل الغاصب من بلدي
وأزيل الغاصب من بلدي
وأبيد فلول الغرباء
وأبيد فلول الغرباء
يا بلد الأقصى والحرم
يا بلد الأقصى والحرم
يا مهد النخوة والكرم
يا مهد النخوة والكرم
صبرا صبرا فالنصر لنا
صبرا صبرا فالنصر لنا
والفجر يطل من الظلم
والفجر يطل من الظلم
قسما سأضحي بدمائي
قسما سأضحي بدمائي
لأروي أرض الكرماء
لأروي أرض الكرماء
لأروي أرض الكرماء
لأروي أرض الكرماء. الله أكبر. عيدها 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 عيدها. تحيا فلسطين العربية الحرة. تحيا فلسطين العربية الحرة. المجد والخلود للشهداء والأبرار. الحرية لأسرار البواسل. القدس نفديها نرويها. القدس.
Okay, Doctor, I'd like to ask Rich Goldberg, for your all these years you've worked on the subject of UNRWA, what's your comment seeing this film?
That is one of the most shocking films I've watched in a while. I saw a comment in the chat that said child abuse. I couldn't agree with that more. It really just reaffirms in video everything that I said in my opening remarks. If the international community, the European nations, United Kingdom, United States, Asian nations like Japan, others who have long time been donors and supporters of UNRWA, cannot take a close look at this moment and say our investment is not advancing our policy for the region. In fact, it is one of the main contradictory items negating our policy quite clearly. If we are supposedly standing for a two-state solution and Palestinian human rights, economic rights, peaceful coexistence of two peoples in this region, how could it be possible that this organization that is teaching an entire generation the things you just saw, how is it possible that the Palestinian people would be ready to make that peace? Our dollars, our taxpayer investments need to have oversight. They need to align with our policy objectives. Our policy is not to foment violence, not to foment anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activity. It is to prepare for peace. And clearly, UNRWA is very off mission.
If I may quote for a moment my colleague, member of Knesset, Benny Begin, who came up with the idea that perhaps they're promoting the two-stage solution, not the two-state solution. And what we saw 3 months ago in Israel, it's only 3 months ago, when 4 Arab cities inside Israel were burning on the issue of right of return to Jaffa, Lod, Ramla, and Akko. all of what have been saying has not been, in a sense, theoretical. I'd like to turn to Baroness Ruth Deitch, your comment on the film and on the subject, and also on the subject of what you just suggested of interparliamentary cooperation on this issue.
Echoing what I said last week when we last met to discuss this, I think one of the problems about the education of Palestinian children is that there is nothing to teach them about their own peoplehood except violence. Other nations teach their children about kings and queens of the past, poetry, literature, architecture, presidents, the law, the constitution, the struggle for freedom, human rights. They have nothing except violence and the Nakba, as they call it, in 1948. Apart from that, it doesn't seem to be a history. Unfortunately, recent years have shown us that most of the civilized world is terrified of violence. Like you, I've been watching the reaction of the Taliban in Afghanistan the last couple of weeks. And to put it very crudely, the violence, the willing to kill, the ability to ignore human rights and the rule of law and justice have propelled these savages to victory, as they would see it, over the Americans. And I think this history of the last 2 weeks will have emboldened every terrorist around the world who's prepared to seek what they want by sheer unbridled violence. And I'm also sorry to say that the world has now learned that America does not stand on its word, that America will not be there for you if things go wrong. And I tremble for Israel if, heaven forbid, Israel was in real trouble and looked to America to defend it, because what's happened in the last few weeks will have convinced, especially the more right-wing Israelis, that all one can do is look after one's own interests and defend oneself. Now, turning to UNRWA and the damage that it is doing, it is a beneficiary of the world's fear of violence. It's a beneficiary of the rotten constitution of the United Nations, where the great majority of states who have one vote each are states who themselves don't give their own people the vote, that are not democratic, that are only too willing to disguise their own authoritarianism by projecting all their evils onto another state, namely Israel. The other reason that UNRWA has deep roots is because it is in fact just an employment agency for Palestinians. It employs, I think it was something like 90,000 people, the great majority of whom are Palestinians. So it's a sort of cannibalistic organization. It feeds off itself. It is in its own interests to foment trouble and poverty amongst Palestinians in order that more Palestinians can be given jobs so that they can continue to stir up hatred amongst the next generation, who in turn will get jobs with UNRWA. It also benefits from the fact that there is no transparency. It's clear that the recent American commitment to try and get UNRWA to reform its ways and its textbooks has no teeth behind it. There is no way to enforce it. And I'm sorry to say that here in the United Kingdom, we have discovered by dint of parliamentary questioning that the normal rules of transparency in relation to the funding that the British taxpayer gives overseas is not applied in the case of UNRWA. Normally, British funding is examined by something called the Publish What You Fund Transparency Index. But in response to a question from me about it, the government said, the government has not pressed Publish What You Fund to include UNRWA in its index, as we respect its independence at UNRWA and do not seek to influence the index's coverage. So they're really cowering before UNRWA and not applying the normal rules of transparency that would be applied to funding of other organizations. Now, there are maybe two ways forward. One has already been discussed, and there is an interparliamentary union. I hope that we who are on this call tonight, led by David Badin, can find a way to harness the interparliamentary union, or a section of it, for good, well-meaning parliamentarians all over the world to press for reform of UNRWA. The other thing in the short term was I looked at UNRWA's advisory board, and I can see that there is a British representative on it, a lady called Mrs. Diane Corner, who is the United Kingdom consul in East Jerusalem. And when my colleagues return to Parliament after our summer break, which will be next week, I will propose to the little group of us in the House of Lords who stand up for Israel that we write to Diane Corner, the UK consul, and ask her to give us an account of how our money is being spent and to demonstrate to her the truth of what's going on. I think I have a video that you showed last time of the so-called summer camps. Clearly, it would be useful to have the video that you showed a few minutes ago about education. Those are two very important and powerful videos that I hope we can use to persuade, at the very least, the UK consul in East Jerusalem.
Thank you very much, Baroness Deitch. I want to say that one of the reasons why the consuls in East Jerusalem are not so informed, UNRWA has engaged the services of some very professional public relations people who speak very nicely, very well, and very charming. And we have it in writing that to New Zealand and to Canada, to the countries we've recently looked at, that everything is fine. The school books are being adjusted. There's rigorous, they use the word rigorous, oversight. Well, that's not something we see. In order to make the issue more clear, I would like to I'd like to ask Dr. Gross to show some examples of the war indoctrination, and then we'll go back to Rich for his additional comments. And then if anyone wants to raise any questions through the chat, please do so. I must say that your involvement is very important because that's the way it is. That's the way it goes. And in democracy, agreement is not essential. Participation is. And I can tell you that the Presidium of the Office of the Secretary General is very worried about the feedback they get, even though the UN hardly puts in any money, but this is very bad for the image of the UN. Dr. Gross, let's take a look at some of the, Dr. Gross, since August 1st, 2000, has been examining the school books that the Palestinian Authority has offered to UNRWA. I must say, historically, before there was one of the issues that bothered people in Israel when I first came here 50 years ago was what they heard about what the school books were like under Jordan and Egypt as war manuals, more or less. And the hope was when the Palestinian Authority, would put out their own textbooks, it would be different. Dr. Gross, let's take a look at what you've been able to find. Again, you've looked at this since August 1st, 2000, and these are some of your conclusions.
Sure. I found three fundamentals in Palestinian education, both in all schools under the Palestinian Authority and in UNRWA schools as well. First, the legitimization of this very existence of the State of Israel and the presence of the Jews, while denying their history in the country and the existence of holy places there. And the other fundamental is demonization of both Israel, which is the source of all evil, the ultimate colonizer, and the Palestinians are the ultimate victim. And besides, we have also the demonization of Jews, who are described as enemies of God, enemies of Islam, enemies of the prophets, beyond the context of the conflict. And the third fundamental is the absence of any peace, advocacy of peace, peaceful resolution to the conflict, and the coexistence with Israel. Instead, we have advocacy of violent struggle for liberation, which does not and at the lines of 57. Let's start with the legitimization. The Palestinian Authority does not call itself the Palestinian Authority. It calls itself the State of Palestine, which is under occupation, and the limits of that occupation are not restricted to the lines of 67. You can see on top right, mark in red, the emblem, and it says the State of Palestine, Dawlat Filastin, not the Palestinian Authority. Next, please. Palestine is Arab and Muslim, and the map includes the whole country, including territories of Israel, and the Palestinian flag is above, and it says Palestine. Next, please. These are all new books, by the way, 2020. None of them is earlier. This is a map of the Levant, and you find Palestine as a sovereign state in the Levant instead of Israel, next to Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Next, please. Israel is not mentioned by its name. Rather, it is called the Zionist occupation. Even if that Zionist occupation signs agreements with foreign countries, it's not a regular state, it's an occupation state, and it says that the Armistice of Rhodes in 1949 was signed by the Zionist occupation in Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon. Next, please. The territories of Israel before 67 is called the territories that were occupied in 1948. داخل الأراضي المحتلة عام 1948. No Israel. Israel does not exist in the Palestinian curriculum as a state, although it's a full member state of the United Nations organization. And UNRWA is committed, I think, by that. But still, in UNRWA schools, they teach the children that Israel does not exist. Palestine replaces it as a sovereign state in the region. Next, please. And the Jews are colonizer, like actually the Americans or all other European nations in other places in the world. And the Palestinians are compared to the original inhabitants of America, the Indians. Next, please. The history of the Jews is denied. It's all fantasies and fairy tales, legends, and they tried in vain to find proofs and archaeological evidence, and they didn't, namely that everything is fake. Next, please. Even the holy places are not recognized. This is the Wailing Wall. It is reproduced in a way that hides, so to speak, the Jews who pray there underneath. And it's a Muslim holy place. Jews took over this place, and they don't have holy places in the country. They don't have history in the country, nothing. And they are colonizers. Next, please. As colonizers, the cities are not shown on the map. You don't find Tel Aviv here. You find Jaffa, not Tel Aviv. And if you find the city, let's say Eilat, underneath, next to the Red Sea, it is called al-Rashash, the name of the desolate place where it was later built. Next, please. Hebrew is erased. You can see it in the British mandatory coin, reproduced in the Palestinian mathematics textbook. And the Hebrew, you can see it on the left. You can see the original coin, and the Hebrew inscription is erased. Next, please. And Jerusalem was built by Arabs, not by any other person, Arabs, many thousand years ago. And it's holy to Muslims and Christians. Jews have no connection. Next, please. And this is a history about the names of Jerusalem. And the very name, Urshalim, Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, which is so spread all over the world, is absent here. Yabus, and then Elia by the Romans. And you have the gap of 1,000 years of Jewish history in the city, which is not mentioned in this particular paragraph. Next, please. Demonization of both Israel and Jews. Well, self-victimization is a way to show that Israel is the victimizer. The Palestinian girl to the children of the world, they murdered my childhood. They slaughter my childhood in front of my eyes, murder the roses in the fields, and so on and so on. Victimization, self-victimization. Next, please. An accusation of genocidal intentions. أقام الصهاينة كيانهم على الإرهاب والإبادة, extermination, and استعمار, colonialism. We shall explain that. This is an assignment. A great thing. Next, please. And this is part of a poem. It says that Jews are actually infidels and the virus AIDS. أين الفوارس للأقصى تحرره من قبضة الكفر من أعوان شيطان. Next, please. And they were enemies of Islam in the times of Prophet Muhammad, and they were not loyal to the contracts they made with him, and the Muslims, they were treacherous and hostile. The Muslims had to fight them, and they did. Next, please. There are no Jews in Arabia today. One of the lessons of a chapter about Jesus Christ, which is considered a prophet in Islam. This is an Islamic education textbook. And it says that Jews are enemies of all God's prophets, namely, they are, by extension, they are enemies of God. Say that to a Muslim children, to a Muslim child, a male or female who come from a traditional society, Jews should be killed this way. This is part of extermination propaganda by UNRWA. Next, please. Peace? Well, it is mentioned once in the history textbooks, but very neutral language, not in advocacy. Yasser Arafat sent a letter to Yitzhak Rabin. It says that Israel has the rights to live in peace and security, and the PLO renounces terror. That's all. You will not find the echo of this commitment in any textbook taught in any school, even by UNRWA. Next, please. What we have instead? The Palestinian national anthem, full of violence, volcano of my revenge, weapons fire, Palestine is my revenge, and I shall die as a Fidai. Fidai is a member of the Palestinian terrorist organization. Next, please. This is how it is depicted to first grade students. Violent struggle for liberation of the whole of Palestine. Let's see it further. Next, please. And this is the anthem of the youth movement of Al-Fatah organization. Part of the liberation, we have carried the ember of the revolution, which is Fatah activity started in 65, before the 67 war. We have carried the ember of the revolution to Haifa, to Jaffa. This is part of the liberated country. These cities should be liberated. Next, please. And this is a language exercise. It would be appropriate for Jaffa to return to our bosom. Hara Jaffa an ta'uda li ahdanina. Next, please. And in Free Palestine, this is an item sold to tourists in Bethlehem. Free Palestine, it says. In Free Palestine, you can see very clearly there is no room for Israel. Next, please. Even the return, the right of return, which they say that is based on the 194 resolution of the United Nations in 1984, which says actually that those who want to return should live in peace with their neighbors. No, they should return to liberated Palestine in order to hoist the Palestinian flag on the hills of the liberated territories. Next, please. The same idea, we shall reclaim it, the homeland, as a sovereign homeland. No Israel. Next, please. Terror is part and parcel of all of that. This is the first out of 4 pages of chapter about Dalal al-Mughrabi, who led the terrorist attack in 1978 against an Israeli civilian bus on Israel's coastal highway, which resulted in the murder, actually, of over 30 persons, civilians, men, women, and children. And she is praised as a hero. Now, this is a very rare example of the answer to the question, what should be done with the remnants of the Jews after the liberation of Palestine? Those who will survive. There are 6 million Jews in Israel today. Now, it should be a war of liberation. Some of them will die, some of them will survive. What should we do with them? We shall exterminate them. I shall read it in Arabic. قسما سأضحي بدمائي لأروي أرض الكرماء. You can see the English on the top. وأزيل الغصب Israel من بلدي وأبيد exterminate فلول الغرباء, the defeated remnant of the foreigners. Now they sing it in class, we have just seen it before, and I should say one important note. Let's move on again. It is from 2019, you can see it clearly, very clear here, grade 3. In 2020, it is not there anymore, it was replaced. So I would say that if one or a state, a donor state, or somebody very influential exerts some pressure on the Palestinian Authority, they will change. They will change things, and this is, I felt so good when I saw the 2020 edition. Now let's move over to the conclusions. Next, please. Palestinian Authority textbooks used by UNRWA in its schools delegitimize the existence of the State of Israel, a full member state of the United Nations organization, and the very presence of its 6 million Jewish citizens in the country. The PA school books used by UNRWA demonize both Israel and the Jews to the point of sheer anti-Semitism. These very books never advocate a peaceful solution to the present Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Instead, they call for a violent struggle for liberation, which is not limited by the 67 lines and in which terror plays a central part. Being a UN agency, UNRWA is committed to neutrality and peace, but its use of such school books sharply contradicts its commitment and makes UNRWA a full accomplice in the PA anti-Semitic indoctrination. Moreover, UNRWA betrays its sacred obligation towards the well-being of the Palestinian children and youth under its care by preparing them for war against their Israeli counterparts. This kind of education, quote unquote, should stop immediately, and the donor states should have a say in this matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gross. I should mention that Dr. Arnon Gross served for 40 years as the Deputy Director of the Arabic Service of the Israel Broadcasting Authority, and holds a doctorate in from Princeton University in Islamic Studies. I want to just ask Yoni, our technical person, to put on the screen our suggestions for policy change. These speak for themselves, and basically anyone who is a citizen of a donor country can insist on these issues. I'm not going to read them aloud. They're very clear: canceling the new UNRWA curriculum, ceasing military training, insisting that UNRWA dismiss employees who are affiliated with Hamas, ask for an audit, and finally, apply UNHCR standards to UNRWA. Ask these people. The people are basically stuck there. They do not want to stay there. Now, I just sent a note at this moment. Has Biden, what's Biden's position? Biden's position was basically adopting these principles. However, Biden handed over the money. Well, UNRWA says it's not going to change anything. So that's the situation. Rich Goldberg, your comment, please.
I would just reiterate and say you've heard a lot in this webinar, you've seen a lot, and the bottom line is we're not passive observers here, just taking notes. We are together the active investors in this program, in this project, in UNRWA. And it's not an autopilot agency if we say it's not anymore. We together have leverage. We together can make demands and conditionality. If I were sitting at the top in charge, I would say we need to have the overall mandate shifted with a date certain that in 5 years UNRWA transitions to what UNHCR's mandate is, which is to move everyone to a post-refugee status, to resettle, repatriate, bring people into self-sufficiency. If you're in Jordan, UNRWA becomes part of Jordan. We transfer our assistance to Jordan to make up the difference in their budget. If you're in the West Bank, those camps become part of the Palestinian Authority, et cetera. If we can't achieve that up front, then we still need to make demands to ensure we don't perpetuate the conflict, make the conflict worse, and foment violence. We get to decide. We can't just send letters to the Secretary General and say, please look into this. We've done that for 20, 30 years. It doesn't improve anything. We can't just have a meeting with UNRWA and say, this is unacceptable, change. It does not accomplish it. We have tried that many times. We can't just ask the Government Accountability Office to write a report. The report comes back to show everything you just saw in this webinar, and nothing ever changes. Things change if we make a change with our money, with our investment, with conditionality. Perhaps there shouldn't be Palestinian teachers in these schools. Perhaps there should be international UN staff that speak fluent Arabic. Perhaps we get to decide the curriculum as the investors. Perhaps there's a great curriculum out there that teaches moderation, Muslim history, and all the basics that you need, arithmetic, reading, science, that we would say, this is the curriculum from now on in every UNRWA school. That's it. The investors have spoken. And then you monitor and you insist on verification. There's other ideas as well, vetting of staff, et cetera, you saw on the list. All of these are good ideas, but they only come from will. The will to act, the will to use our influence and our leverage, and ultimately the willingness to walk away with our money if these changes aren't made. Thanks for having me.
Thank you again, Rich Goldberg. I must mention that this video, which we're seeing tonight, this program, this webinar, will be used as in a sense, a working document for parliamentarians in the English-speaking world as much as we can. People watching this program who want to help us promote it, that's very, very important. Contributing is very important. I'm going to have our host, our technical person, Yoni, put the signs of our websites. There's way to how to give money so this can happen. I can just say that too many people say, "Oh, it's going to be okay." The PR people from there you see our two websites, and there if you go onto those websites, you'll see exactly how funds can be transferred. Right now, it's going the opposite direction. Germany is right now the leading funder of UNRWA. Germany has seen these textbooks, has seen these films. We made presentations at the Bundestag. And Germany next month, on September 26th, is having an election. And perhaps we'll have an impact on the election because we're going to be meeting and presenting in German to a number. We have a German-speaking staff here to show exactly what's going on. I think 6 million was enough, right? I mean, this is something which never again, right? I mean, these are issues that can be raised in a very clear way. The message that UNRWA proposes is very, very serious. Sitting where I'm sitting at my desk, where I've been here for this desk for 34 years, was Robert Wistrich, a wonderful professor who was the expert in Israel and the world, perhaps, on anti-Semitism. And he looked at this material and he said that we asked him, well, how does this compare to what you saw with the Nazi education? He said, well, whereas Nazi education did have the demonization that Dr. Gross pointed out, but no mention in Nazi education of the praise of war, the praise of those who murdered Jews, etc. And they've gone a step beyond it. Now, what they've convinced the donor community and what they're trying to convince the U.S. Congress is that they're going through a process of change. One of the great lies used by UNRWA is they have what they call Holocaust education, that they're teaching about the mass murder of the Jews in the UNRWA schools, which we have a letter from the UN that didn't happen. All I can say is support what we're trying to do here. The message tonight, which most of Congress right now is involved with, the post-Afghanistan, this date, August 31st, 2021. Right now, today, as this is being given, Congress is basically distracted, and understandably by the situation in Afghanistan. But the situation is what it is. This week, the new school year begins in UNRWA, and your feedback, the donor nations, is very, very important. And not to accept the PR people. I find it very interesting that the same woman who was doing U.S. policy on UNRWA, is now a lobbyist for UNRWA and something called UNRWA, USA UNRWA. Very interesting how that works, understanding the weaknesses. And I'm convinced that this issue is a universal issue. It's a consensus issue. There is no one in the world, in the Western world certainly, who favors an issue of a new state coming into existence whose purpose is to have full-scale war against the other state based on a curriculum. And the reason why we showed you the films and the reason why we started showing the films and conducting films and facilitating these films is because no one believed that these books were being taught. When we received the books in 2000, it's not going to be taught. Well, by 2009, we started showing exactly what's going on. So there is and by the way, someone just asked, was there any explanation from the Biden administration? The Biden administration has said there are very clear criteria for aid. It's simply not being reinforced. So you look on my website, IsraelBehindTheNews.com or UNRWAMonitor.com to see all of the Biden. I have a column in the Jerusalem Report where I've been reporting this. You'll see all of Biden's commitments, and basically holding Biden's feet to the fire is very, very important right now. And we have many Democrats very upset what they see in the UNRWA school books. Why would the theme of the United Nations schools is peace starts here, but this is the opposite. It's like a bizarro world, like a George Orwell world. But I want to say one thing: let my people know. When people know, they may respond. And to sit back passively after you've seen basically an education for murder, not for hatred, but for violence and for murder, there's no excuse for that. And that's all I can say. That's what motivates me not to retire, and to bring in good young people to work with us. And I'm encouraged by the endorsement of the Baroness Deitch this evening. It's here, it's evening in Israel, but of a kind of an international parliamentary force, parliamentary lobby, whatever you want to call it. Very important. There is to hear on this Thursday that New Zealand was told by my people working with UNRWA, oh, don't worry, UNRWA doesn't pay for these books. What is the UNRWA school budget? The UNRWA budget is $870 million. To say they're not paying for the books, they're just getting them is simply not credible. Anyone else want to say anything? Anyone else want to offer any comment? Now the question was there any explanation from the Biden administration? We have not gotten any response. We've asked the Biden administration, are you aware of the fact that you've restored funding without conditions? And we did not get a response to that. That's part of the issue. And I do say there is a senator who basically advanced the GAO report 3 years ago, Senator James Risch of Idaho, and he doesn't have a Jewish constituency. The guy opened up the books, sees what's there, and he sees what's there. Said, "This is not what children should be learning." When we have a normal book like this, a 5th grade book, and I've shown this in other presentations, and I'm happy to send it to extra copies to people to see. But you see the picture of a woman who carried out a terror attack, murdering more than 30 people, and also the niece of Senator Ripikoff, whom she met on the beach, and Gail Rubin. This is in 1978, and her legacy is being promoted. And there's 3 pages here on how children going to an UNRWA United Nations school should grow up to be like her. I find this to be unbelievable. But what's most unbelievable is the silence of the people, the silence of the media, the silence even of our many government people in Israel. And all we're saying is, I had the privilege of hearing Elie Wiesel many times talk about the Jews of silence. This is not a time for silence. Dr. Gross, how do you account for what this is, what we're seeing here?
Very clear, very simple. They want to replace us. And UNRWA participates in this effort.
That's the story. And Dr. Gross, you made a presentation, several presentations at the German Parliament. What can you say about the Bundestag? What can you say about their response?
Not only the German Parliament, in every place, people were shocked. But later on, they returned to the ordinary things, ordinary businesses, and forgot. This is my impression. And I've been working on this for over 20 years. Shocking. They are shocked at the beginning and then later on. And I think, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that Israel is the main culprit here. The state government of Israel should have been the first to shout and call the whole world to business, and he doesn't.
I just met with Benny Begin. I hope he does so. He's now back in the Knesset. I hope that different groups, left, right, and center, will make an issue out of this. This used to be, by the way, one of the stories, one of the prime issues of the Israeli left wing and the Israeli peace movement, because if you don't get the people out of the refugee camps into decent situations of life, what are we going to have? I want to thank you all for being in touch this evening. Take a look at our website, israelbehindthenews.com and UNRWAmonitor.com to be more informed and to get involved and to help us let people know. Thank you.